Hello, this is Patrick Cawley with Keystone Elder Law. This is Keynotes, a series of conversations about issues affecting the elderly, people with special needs, and veterans of the armed forces. Selling real estate is a crucial consideration when it comes to estate planning, estate administration after the property owner has passed away, and sometimes even in Medicaid planning for long-term care. It's certainly a consideration for everybody who, as they get older and they're thinking about downsizing. So I am joined today by Aaron Piscioneri of Century 21 Realty Services in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, to talk about some of his experiences and his tips and pointers for each of these contexts when it comes to selling real estate. Aaron, thank you for joining me.
Hello, how are you?
Great. For those watching a video here and not just listening to the audio, you can see that Camp Hill, Pennsylvania is featured prominently in the background for Aaron with the ocean waves coming in and the palm trees. So that's a nice reminder of how nice Camp Hill is.
It gets a little warmer towards the south end of town.
Well, that's true. That's true. So let's talk about downsizing first. No doubt, how long have you been in the business, and I guess I should provide some context. How long have you been doing this, and how frequently is it, I guess, that clients come to you in the context of downsizing, or they're thinking about getting a value on their house because they're weighing their options?
It's a pretty common discussion that I have with people. I've been selling real estate since 2004, and a lot of the work that I've done has been with downsizing, or right sizing as we sometimes call it, and estates.
Okay. Well, I think one trend I've seen when it comes to the homes themselves is more of a focus by the construction industry on aging in place, making certain improvements to the house that will make it safer for an older person who might not be as steady on their feet, or other improvements just to make it a safe and livable house. And that makes sense. I've seen surveys from the likes of AARP and other organizations that show that overwhelmingly people want to stay in their homes for as long as they can. And that makes sense. It's, there's a lot of memories and nostalgia when it comes to the home. So people might want to stay there as long as possible. What's your experience with making improvements and aging in place as opposed to selling and downsizing to a whole new space?
A lot of times the preference is going to be to try and age in place or stay in place. And a lot of that depends on how appropriate the house space is to living, where you might not be able to go on the second floor of a house. And then also, care of the property in general is important when making this consideration.
So some of the improvements that I'm thinking of, and maybe you've seen, are, grab bars in bathroom showers or bathtubs, ramps, things like that. I think the first thought that a lot of people might have is, what does this do to the value of the house? Is this a wise investment? Is that a conversation that you've had with them?
Absolutely. I think if it's about somebody staying in place in the home, I think that it's a larger consideration that the person is happy and healthy and safe, rather than are they going to get $3,000 back because they put $3,000 worth of grab bars and handicap accessibility accessories into their house. So say you live in a ranch house that can be easily converted with a small ramp and some grab bars. I don't think that the value should be consideration, because the money that you'll save in happiness, or it's not money that you save in happiness, but the amount of happiness and enjoyment that that person will have, I think far out exceeds any kind of investment that they may or may not get out of the house later.
And I think that's a good point when you consider that the alternative might be having to go into a facility, which might be, a great place to live. It might provide for all of their needs. But if, without that grab bar, they could have a fall. And often a fall is sort of it starts a downward cycle of health consequences, and before you know it, the person is looking at skilled nursing care, which could run $10,000 a month in the spring of 2020. So maybe a little bit of prevention is the best investment they could make.
Absolutely. Prevention is good. The one thing that I would consider with your aging, if this is you making a decision for another person, say your parents are aging, I would consider how easily they're able to go about their day-to-day life in general. And if it's really just a safety thing and they just need, a ramp and a couple modifications, it's a good thing to do those. But if they're at the point where taking care of a house seems to be beyond them, I think that's when you should probably talk to a real estate agent and get a good idea of what the best next option is.
So let's consider a family that might come to you talking about downsizing, either to a smaller, like a condo where they wouldn't have to do yard work, or to a retirement community. What are some of the first, how does that conversation go when that family comes to you?
Well, it depends on who's coming to me. Sometimes this is a child making a purchase or a decision for their parents. Vast majority of the time, it is the people who are, if they are going to be buying a condo or move into a 55 plus community, or there are certainly a lot of other types of communities that have been built in the last few years that have a lot of the same amenities that 55 plus communities have, but they're not necessarily labeled a 55 plus community.
So how would you differentiate those? Or how would you explain the difference to somebody?
So a condo would just be a place that you don't have to take care of the exterior. You're just responsible for the interior. It would be an easier way of living. Some of them are on one level. Some of them are townhouses or on multiple levels. That really is dependent upon the neighborhood. 55 plus communities oftentimes offer a social component in addition to living. So it's more about your general lifestyle. And there are different 55 plus communities in the area, and they have different styles of housing, but most are one level living, or the main level have a main level bedroom on them. And you don't need to do stairs if you don't want to. They usually have some kind of either pool or gathering area, and some of them even have additional long-term care considerations after you're not able to take care of a home anymore.
So once you describe that difference, that I would imagine would narrow down what's appropriate for that particular family and their loved one. What are the next considerations? I'm sure people ask what kind of improvements they should make to the house they would be selling to move to that new place. That might be one question that comes up. What are the range of questions or issues that get discussed?
So all people are coming from a different house. And sometimes, I've worked with people where they're downsizing, but the house that they're buying, that they're supposedly downsizing, costs more than the house that they're selling, because they're looking for a certain lifestyle or they have a certain budget. So the type of improvements that you do to your house is going to be totally dependent on the price range of the house, the neighborhood where it's located. It's generally a good idea to involve a real estate agent, a realtor, sooner in the process than later. I wouldn't go spending a lot of money on things before you meet with an agent. Some of the improvements that people feel like brings additional value to their house, you don't always get that additional value. And sometimes people are disappointed when they have spent a lot of money on, say, putting all new windows in a house. and they're not getting that money back out of it because it's one thing to replace windows from the 1950s. It's another thing to replace windows from the 1990s. Considerations like that make it truly a unique decision to the property.
And I would imagine that's not all that different from conversations you have with younger people who are putting in, $50,000 kitchens and then expect to get every penny of it back because they've created this beautiful space in their houses. And the reality is they're not always going to get that money back. So that's definitely something that I would imagine a real estate agent can help with in terms of the experience you have in seeing how that improvement made it a property that's quicker to sell, or what the comps are for that kind of a property in that neighborhood, and whether you're really going to be able to get to the price point that you want.
Yes. So it depends if you're making this decision for your parents and you're involved in it. Just remember that you might have to be the person who's managing the process and making many of the decisions. And if your parent is living there while you're doing the improvements, I think that their happiness and well-being should be a strong consideration in that. And this is all, if they're living on their own and have not done improvements to their house, I think the idea of improving the house around them while they're there could be probably stressful and do more harm in terms of making it a stressful situation for you and or your parent relative to the amount of additional money that you would get for the property. I've noticed that with these moves in general, if you have the financial ability, that it's best to move into the facility first and then sell the house afterwards.
Have you seen cases where, the house hasn't been upgraded since the 1970s and it might just be better to put the house on the market as it is rather than try to anticipate what a younger family might be looking for when they purchase the house and go through the hassle of doing all those upgrades?
Absolutely. But you just need to keep in mind that you will have to sell it for less money. You're not going to get top dollar for the house. So if you price it, 10, 15% below what other houses are selling for in the neighborhood, you could save yourself the hassle of doing all those upgrades and renovations and taking the risk of spending the money that you sometimes don't get all of it back. You can just price it lower, sell it quickly, and make it a smoother process for your parents.
Let's talk about the involvement of real estate agents in estate planning or working with the sale of a property that is now a part of an estate because the owner has passed away. What kind of experience do you have in that regard?
It's all over the map because you have different family situations for every property. In the case where it's a single child who is the only beneficiary and executor, a lot of times it just kind of falls on that child, and I don't know that parent needs to do a lot of work ahead of time to manage that process. It can be different. Family dynamics often come into play when there are families making a decision. I see from where I sit, a lot of times if there's, it's good to make one person in charge. The idea of co-executors or executrixes, I think, can sometimes cause some problems.
We give that same advice, by the way, and for reasons that extend even beyond the real estate, but I can imagine why it would make your life a little more difficult. But we also encourage people to name a primary executor and then have a backup only if that first person resigns, and just can't handle it or is unavailable or whatever the case may be. And, that's an interesting conversation because parents often don't want to appear that they're slighting another child or saying we trust one child more than the other, but we try to tell them that's not what this is. This is, if anything, you're adding an administrative burden to the life of one child, and so it's not really doing them a favor. And we have ways of explaining to the children that maybe because one is local and the other is not, or one doesn't have as many responsibilities in their life, and so they have some more free time to be an executor. But when it comes down to it, what kind of problems have you run into because there's multiple executors?
I think a lot of times it comes from a good place from the executors, and I think that a lot of time they end up being kind of deferential to one another, and because they're not the only person involved in the decision making, and they're maybe not used to making decisions together. It's not like a husband and wife who are used to making decisions together. You're talking about siblings who either have a close relationship or don't, but maybe don't make these types of decisions every day together. I think that a lot of times it can slow down the process. And I think that sometimes you have one child maybe who is interested in improving the property, another one who just wants to be done with it. There's also sometimes considerations to make in terms of, if one of your children has personal problems versus other ones that don't. You don't always need to make your kids the executors. Sometimes it could be a family friend, or a sibling of yours too.
That's a good point. And I think occasionally some attorneys or accountants or other professionals will be happy to fill that role. But I think the point you're getting at there is sometimes taking that kind of responsibility out of the family, outside of the children, saves the family from discord that they otherwise would not have. You're taking away a reason for them to fight, and allowing a third party to make decisions without any appearance of self-dealing. So no sibling can point at another and say, you're just trying to do what's best for you in terms of what you might inherit, or whatever the circumstances might be. It just takes all of that infighting out of the picture.
Yes. There's another thing that people do in terms of estates. A lot of times people that are managing estates look for what they perceive to be an easy sale, when it is not necessarily, where maybe there's a grandchild or a niece or nephew or somebody who wants to, or even one of the siblings want to buy the property. It's my opinion that, whether you're selling it for sale by owner or with an agent, you're probably better off to liquidate the property, get as much as you can for it, and then if you want to make some kind of concession to that person that you wanted to sell the property to, give them some extra portion of the estate, if that's
right. That comes up from time to time, where the parent wants to leave a property to one child, but then feels that it's unequal treatment toward another child or children. And you point out you can still change beneficiary designations on a 401k or a life insurance policy, and make up for the difference, so to speak, by including the other child in a different way, especially if that child doesn't need a property. They have their own, they're all set up. So one of the other things too that I've seen, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when I see people say leaving a property to one child and then maybe leaving the 401k to another, make sure that you have hired an attorney who knows how to do estate work when you're doing that. I have seen people do that, and it causes challenges and problems for the estate later on by using a degree of specificity. In terms of chain of title, I know one time there was a property that I sold that the seller had left, or the deceased had left one property to 3 relatives and another property to another 3 relatives. When we had to do the title, I think 6 or, well, no, because I think some of the spouses had to sign off on it too. This deed was signed over by 15 people, I think, that we had to send all over the state to get it signed beforehand. So it can cause sometimes some extra legwork for people that you are not intending to make do extra work.
And as you said earlier, people often do things like that with the best of intentions, but then they end up making it needlessly complicated. So I assure anybody listening to this conversation that I did not prompt you or compensate you for suggesting an estate planning attorney, but I think that's absolutely what can happen, and just keeping things simple sometimes requires a little bit of careful planning and thinking, but it makes all the difference in the end. One other thing I've seen is you know, rather than downsizing or moving out of the home, in order, I guess, in an attempt to stay independent, is to have a child or somebody else move into the house, I guess under the guise of being a caregiver. I don't know if you've seen that and how it complicates a real estate transaction. We typically, if there's a caregiver and that's the stated purpose for moving in, we of course want to be very clear about a few things. We don't want an older person being financially exploited, and there might be certain things we need to do there as elder law attorneys. And secondly, if the older person might end up in long-term care, we put in place a caregiver agreement. So there's an actual contract, and the person who moves in gets paid a certain amount of money for specified services. It not only takes care of the exploitation concern, but it also avoids the appearance to the Medicaid folks in the government that there's just an outright gift, because that would disqualify that person from having long-term care benefits. Have you ever seen this scenario where there's somebody who's living in as a caregiver, and does that complicate your job at all?
Absolutely. I think a lot of times where I see this have the most negative consequences to either the property, the parent, or the family. Many times an older person will maybe have some younger relative move in with them, say a niece or a nephew, grandchild. And you know, you have 2 people that have 2 different kinds of lifestyles in many cases. And I have seen, or been on the back end usually, of a lot of situations where this does not work out. Either the person does not take care of the property to the expectations of the rest of the people involved, and can cause some family strife that way. You see people making accusations of favoritism to a particular relative or a particular branch of a family. I would be careful about doing that type of thing. And, you know, most of the people that I see do that, they're not necessarily, they're usually helping out the relative. It's not usually that the person who, the older person that the younger person is moving in with needs a high level of help. Maybe, you know, maybe they need a little help doing some chores and yard work, but they're not necessarily confined to a portion of the space and need a high level of care. Some
of the cases I've seen involve, for example, a nephew, like you said, and nephew's wife move in with grandma. And it starts with the idea that, well, grandma is less and less able to mow the lawn, take care of exterior maintenance, and just generally keep up the house. And that all starts with as a good idea on paper, but like you said, lifestyles can conflict, and after a few months, it's no longer the good idea that they thought it was going to be. Nobody really feels comfortable in the house. And unfortunately, there's at least one reported case in the realm of elder exploitation, where the nephew gets more and more convinced that the house should be deeded over to him, and or compensation should be granted. Usually it's the deed coming over, and then when everyone's sort of sours on the arrangement, nephew and his wife just say, you know what, forget it, we're out of here, and they just skip town, they leave, they go somewhere else and stop paying the mortgage that for the house they now are on the deed for. And then what happens to grandma in the house she's been in for a very long time? She's going to get kicked out because nobody's paying the mortgage. So, and it starts gradually with that nephew becoming more and more entitled to compensation or to something for what he believes he's doing for his grandma, and grandma just giving it over without talking to an elder law attorney. And before you know it, it's just a terrible mess. And you have to step in and go to court usually in a case like that.
Yeah, the other thing that, it usually starts innocently, and maybe even the person who moves in isn't even causing a problem. But say they move in, the grandparent dies, and they're still living in the house. They don't necessarily have a plan or somewhere to go. And nobody in the family wants to kick them out. So I see properties and estates just kind of languish and take a long time to get resolved because they're trying to make an accommodation to one family member who's living in the house. And again, it might not even be the type of situation where anyone is doing anything wrong, but they just can't. I think that it's important to move on when you're in that situation and not have these estates linger for months or years when you can avoid it.
Agreed. Aaron, thank you so much. And how can people get in touch with you at Century 21 Realty Services in Camp Hill?
Well, best way to reach me is my cell phone, 717-579-5217. You may also feel free to do research on me online to look for reviews. I can also be reached by email at aaron.piscioneri@gmail.com.
And I will include that information when I post this conversation, so people can just find you one click away. Aaron, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.